March 14th, 2016, Red Willow County, Nebraska. At exactly 6:18 in the morning, the sun was just starting to rise over a frozen pasture outside the small town of McCook. The light was pale and cold, the kind that turns the prairie silver for a few quiet minutes before the day begins. A long line of cattle trucks rolled slowly down County Road 719, one after another, engines rumbling, trailers rattling. Inside those trailers were herds that had taken years, sometimes generations, to build, and that morning, almost every one of those animals was heading to the auction yard because the cattle market had collapsed. Feed prices had doubled. Banks were getting nervous, and across Nebraska, farmers were making a painful decision. They were selling their cattle, just to survive. But one rancher standing at the edge of his pasture wasn't loading a single animal while everyone else was selling. He was keeping his entire herd, and most people believed he had just made the worst financial decision of his life. Let me tell you about him. His name was Caleb Turner. 54 years old, tall, quiet, and built like someone who had spent 40 years lifting hay bales instead of going to a gym. Caleb owned a modest cattle ranch about 12 miles outside McCook. Nothing fancy. 380 acres of rolling prairie, a weathered red barn that had been patched more times than anyone could count, and a farmhouse that still had the same creaky wooden porch his parents built in the early 1970s. Caleb hadn't planned to become a rancher. Stay with me until the end. Before we begin, please take a moment to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and comment where you're watching from. Now, let's get into it. When he was 23, he was actually studying agricultural mechanics at the community college in North Platte. He had dreams of opening a repair shop, maybe working on tractors, combines, anything with an engine. But life has a way of rewriting plans. In 1992, Caleb's father, Thomas Turner, died suddenly from a stroke while fixing a fence on the north pasture. One minute he was working, the next minute he was gone. Just like that, the ranch fell into Caleb's hands, the bank loan, the cattle, the land taxes, everything. Caleb dropped out of college 2 weeks later. He came home, and he stayed. For the next 30 years, he built the ranch slowly. Careful decisions, small risks, nothing flashy. His main herd was Black Angus, about 146 head by 2016. Not huge, but healthy, profitable, and most importantly, debt-free. Caleb followed one rule his father used to repeat every winter at the kitchen table. Never build a ranch that only works when prices are good. At the time, Caleb didn't fully understand what that meant, but he understood it now, because in early 2016, the cattle market was collapsing faster than anyone expected. The previous summer had been brutal. Corn prices surged, feed costs skyrocketed, drought in several states reduced grazing land. And when ranchers started selling cattle early to avoid feeding costs, the market flooded with animals, too many cattle, not enough buyers. Prices dropped hard, then they dropped again. By February, the average market price had fallen nearly 35% from the previous year, and panic spread through farming communities. Like wildfire, auctions were packed, trailers lined up for miles. Farmers who had raised cattle their entire lives were selling entire herds in a single afternoon, including Caleb's neighbors, especially one of them, a man named Victor Hale. Victor was 47 and ran one of the largest ranch operations in Red Willow County. Nearly 2,100 acres, hundreds of cattle, and equipment that looked like it had just rolled out of a dealership showroom. He owned a massive 2015 Case IH Magnum 380 tractor, bright red and spotless. Victor believed in growth, bigger herds, more land, more don'ts. And for a while it worked beautifully. But when feed prices doubled, that strategy started collapsing under its own weight. One chilly morning in early March, Victor pulled his brand new diesel truck into Caleb's gravel driveway. Caleb was repairing a section of fence near the barn. Victor stepped out, boots crunching on frost-covered dirt. "You hear about the auction tomorrow?" Victor called out. Caleb nodded without looking up. "Yeah." Victor leaned against the fence post. "Half the county's selling." Caleb tightened a bolt and wiped his hands on his jeans. "I figured." Victor looked out across Caleb's pasture. The cattle were grazing quietly, completely unaware of the financial storm surrounding them. "You hauling yours in?" Victor asked. Caleb shook his head. "No." Victor laughed softly, like someone hearing a joke. "You serious?" "Yep." Victor pushed his hat back and stared at the herd. "Caleb, prices are terrible. Feed's killing everyone. You'll lose a fortune." Caleb shrugged. "Maybe." Victor stepped closer. "I'm selling 500 head tomorrow. Cutting losses." Caleb didn't argue, he just nodded. Victor waited a moment, expecting Caleb to change his mind, but Caleb simply picked up his wrench again and continued working. "On the fence." Victor shook his head slowly. "Man, sometimes I think you're the most stubborn rancher in Nebraska." Caleb finally smiled. "My dad used to say patience looks like stupidity for a while," Victor chuckled. "Well, tomorrow we'll see who's right." He climbed back into his truck and drove away. The next morning, Victor hauled his cattle to the McCook livestock auction. Hundreds of animals, years of breeding, gone in a few hours. The average price that day, $890 per head. Nearly half what cattle had sold for just 18 months earlier. But back at Caleb Turner's ranch, something different was happening. His cattle stayed in the pasture, his hay barns were full, and every evening, as the sun dipped low over the Nebraska prairie, Caleb climbed onto the seat of his old 1981 John Deere 4440 tractor and carried feed out to the herd, quietly, patiently, because what nobody else knew, not Victor, not the auction buyers, not even the bank managers watching the market crash, was that Caleb Turner had been preparing for a year like this for nearly 2 decades, and, while everyone else was reacting to the crisis, Caleb was waiting. But the real reason he could wait is a story that started 20 years earlier, and to understand that part, let me tell you about the winter that almost destroyed the Turner Ranch, the winter that almost destroyed the Turner. Ranch began on a night Caleb Turner never forgot, January 7, 1997, Red Willow County, Nebraska. The storm hit at 1:40 in the morning, not a gentle snowfall, not the quiet kind that settles over the prairie like a blanket. This one came in sideways. Wind screamed across the open fields at nearly 50 miles an hour. Snow blasted against the farmhouse windows so hard it sounded like handfuls of gravel. Inside the small wooden house, 25-year-old Caleb Turner sat up suddenly in bed. For a moment, he listened. Then he heard it, the distant sound of cattle, bawling. Caleb swung his legs onto the cold floor and pulled on his boots without even turning the lights on. He had only owned the ranch for 5 years at that point. 5 years since his father, Thomas Turner, collapsed from a stroke in the north pasture and never made it back to the house. 5 years of learning ranching the hard way. And nights like this were the hardest. Outside, the cold punched him in the face the moment he opened the door. The wind ripped across the prairie like it owned the land. Caleb climbed into the cab of his old 1981 John Deere 4440, the tractor his father had bought used the year Caleb turned 12. He turned the key. The engine groaned. For a long moment it sounded like it might not start. Then finally the diesel roared to life. The headlights cut through the snow as Caleb drove slowly toward the south pasture where his cattle were grazing, or, at least, where they had been grazing before the storm. When he reached the gate, the sight made his stomach drop. The fence had collapsed under the weight of drifting snow, and half the herd was gone. Caleb jumped down into knee-deep snow and scanned the white darkness. The wind carried the distant sound of cattle moving somewhere out across the prairie. If they wandered too far, they could freeze before morning, or worse, fall into the irrigation ditch that ran along the western property line. Caleb climbed back onto the tractor and followed the faint tracks disappearing into the storm. For nearly 2 hours he searched. The snow kept getting heavier. The wind kept pushing harder. Finally, nearly a mile from the ranch house, he spotted them. 23 head of black Angus clustered against a line of frozen cottonwood trees. Their backs were already coated with snow. Caleb eased the tractor toward them slowly, using the headlights to guide them back toward the ranch. By the time he got the cattle into the barn lot, the sky was beginning to lighten with the gray glow of early morning. He shut the tractor off and sat there for a moment. Breathing hard, his hands were shaking from the cold. But when he stepped down from the tractor and counted the herd, Something felt wrong. He counted again, then again. 23 cattle were missing. Caleb searched the pastures for most of the morning. Around noon he found them. They had fallen into a shallow ravine near the frozen irrigation ditch. The snowdrift had hidden the edge of the ground. The cattle had slipped, and the cold had done the rest. 23 animals, gone in a single night at the time. Each animal was worth around $720. To a large rancher, that would have been painful. To Caleb Turner, it was nearly catastrophic. By the time he finished dragging the last carcass from the ravine, the financial reality had already started settling into his mind. The ranch had just lost over $16,000 in one storm. That might not sound like much to people outside farming. But to a young rancher barely holding things together, it was the difference between surviving and failing. 3 days later, Caleb drove into town to meet with the bank. The building sat on Main Street in McCook, a plain brick structure that smelled faintly of old paper and coffee. The loan officer, Martin Galloway, sat across from Caleb with a calculator and a yellow legal pad. Martin was polite, but direct. "You've had a rough winter," he said. Caleb nodded. "Yes, sir." Martin tapped his pencil on the desk. "With the livestock loss and feed costs, your operating loan is going to need adjustment." Caleb already knew what that meant. "How much?" he asked quietly. Martin flipped the calculator around. The number read $128,000. Caleb stared at it. "That's the only way we can keep you running through next season," Martin explained. "A larger loan gives you breathing room." For a long moment, Caleb didn't say anything. Outside the window, he could see trucks passing slowly along the snowy street. Farmers, ranchers, people just like him, trying to hold things together. Finally, Caleb looked back at the banker. "My dad had a rule," he said. Martin waited. Caleb spoke slowly. "He always said a ranch that depends on loans is a ranch that doesn't belong to you." Martin sighed. "Caleb, sometimes borrowing is necessary." Caleb nodded. "I understand." Martin slid the paperwork across the desk. "Think about it." Caleb folded the paper once, then placed it back on the desk. "I don't need to think about it," Martin frowned. "You're refusing the loan?" "Yes, sir." Martin leaned back in his chair. "That's a risky decision." Caleb stood up. "Maybe." Martin looked genuinely puzzled. "How do you plan to recover without capital?" Caleb paused at the office door. "I'm going to make the ranch smaller." Martin blinked. "Smaller?" "Yes, sir." Instead of expanding to chase profit, Caleb did the opposite. He sold part of the herd, reduced expenses, started growing and storing his own hay. He repaired every piece of equipment himself. Every dollar saved went back into the ranch. And slowly, year after year, something unusual began happening. The Turner Ranch became stronger during bad years. While other ranches grew fast during good markets, Caleb built something quieter, something steadier. A ranch that didn't panic when prices fell and, nearly 20 years later, that quiet decision was about to change everything. Because while the rest of Red Willow County was selling cattle during the 2016 crisis, Caleb Turner had something they didn't: feed, time, and patience. But the real turning point of the crisis had not happened yet. And when it finally did, even the rancher who laughed at Caleb would realize he had misunderstood the entire game. Spring arrived slowly in Red Willow County that year, April 22nd, 2016. The prairie grass was just beginning to turn green again, thin streaks of color spreading across the brown winter fields like paint slowly soaking into dry paper. At 6:05 in the morning, Caleb Turner was already in the barn. The air smelled like hay and diesel fuel. He climbed onto the seat of his John Deere 4440, the same tractor he had started on that brutal winter night 19 years earlier. The paint had faded to a dull green. The cab rattled slightly when the engine ran, but the machine still worked, and Caleb liked things that still worked. He drove slowly toward the feed stacks behind the barn, 20 long rows of tightly packed hay bales stretched across the edge of the property like a small golden wall. Each bale weighed just over 200 pounds. Caleb had baled them the previous summer himself, day after day in July heat. Most ranchers sold extra hay when prices were high. Caleb never did. He stacked it, saved it, prepared for the kind of year nobody wanted, and now that quiet habit was the only reason his cattle were still standing in the pasture. Across the county, things looked very different. Many ranches that had sold cattle during the winter now had empty fields, fences with nothing behind them, barns that suddenly felt too large, and farmers who were watching the market every morning with a mixture of hope and regret. Because something strange had begun happening. Prices had stopped falling. No one talked about it loudly, yet. But buyers at auctions had started bidding slightly higher. Not much, just enough for people to notice. The reason was simple. Too many cattle had been sold. Across Nebraska, Kansas, and parts of Colorado, ranchers had reduced their herds dramatically. During the winter panic, at first that flooded the market, but now it had created the opposite problem. Supply was shrinking, and buyers were starting to compete again. Caleb saw the early signs. He wasn't excited. He wasn't celebrating. He simply kept feeding his herd. Patience had taught him something most markets eventually reveal. Recovery doesn't start loudly. It begins quietly, almost invisibly. But not everyone noticed. One afternoon in early May, Caleb was repairing a water pump near the south pasture when he heard the sound of a truck approaching. He looked up. A large black diesel pickup rolled down the gravel driveway and stopped near the barn. Victor Hale stepped out. He looked different than he had a few months earlier. Less confident, more tired. The stress of the winter had taken something out of him. Victor walked slowly toward the pasture fence and leaned against it. Caleb walked over, wiping grease from his hands. "Afternoon," Caleb said. Victor nodded. "Afternoon." For a moment, neither man spoke. They both watched the cattle grazing quietly across the field. Victor finally broke the silence. "You still got the whole herd?" "Pretty much," Caleb replied. Victor nodded slowly. "I heard prices ticked up." "Last week?" "Little bit," Caleb said. Victor kicked at a small rock with his boot. "I should have waited." Caleb didn't respond right away. Finally, he said gently, "You did what you had to do." Victor sighed. 500 head gone, sold for under 900 each. He looked out at Caleb's herd again. Those cattle might be worth 1,200 by fall if this keeps up. Caleb shrugged. "Maybe." Victor gave a quiet laugh. "You always say maybe." Caleb smiled slightly. "Markets don't like people who act too certain." Victor leaned on the fence for a long moment. Then he said something that sounded almost like a confession. "You know what the hardest part was?" Caleb waited. Victor rubbed his chin, watching those trailers pull away. His voice got quieter. "Felt like selling pieces of the ranch." Caleb understood that feeling better than most people. Cattle weren't just numbers on a balance sheet. They were years of breeding, years of care, calves born during freezing nights, animals you watched grow season after season. Victor straightened up and looked at Caleb. "You really never thought about selling?" Caleb thought for a moment. "Once." Victor raised an eyebrow. "When?" "Back in January, when the feed bill hit." Victor laughed. "What stopped you?" Caleb looked out at the pasture. "My father used to say something." Victor waited. Caleb spoke slowly. "Panic is expensive." Victor nodded slowly. "That might be the truest thing I've heard all year." The two men stood there quietly for a moment. Then Victor looked across the pasture one more time. "Mind if I ask you something honestly?" "Sure." Victor took a breath. "How did you prepare for something like this?" Caleb pointed toward. "The hay rows behind the barn, same way you prepare for winter." Victor followed his finger and stared at the stacked bales. "You stored all that yourself?" "Every year." Victor shook his head. "That's a lot of work." Caleb smiled. "Hard work is cheaper than debt." Victor laughed softly. "I'm starting to see that." He climbed back into his truck but paused before closing the door. "You know, if prices really rebound this year," he looked out at Caleb's herd, "you might be the only rancher in this county who still has cattle to sell." Caleb didn't answer. He simply tipped his hat and walked back toward the barn. But Victor was righter than he realized, because over the next 4 months, the cattle market didn't just recover. It surged, and by the time autumn arrived in Willow County, The quiet decision Caleb Turner made when everyone else panicked would turn into the most talked about move any rancher in that county had seen in decades.